China. The year is 1966. The streets are filling with posters, red banners waving in the wind, and millions of young voices shouting slogans that echo through the cities. A storm is coming, a storm that will reshape an entire nation. But before we step into that chaos, let's go back a little to understand why it all began. Why did Mao Zedong, one of the most powerful leaders in the world, decide to turn his own country upside down? This is the story of how the Cultural Revolution began. After centuries of war, invasion, and poverty, China finally seemed to have peace. In 1949, Mao Zedong and his Communist Party had won the Civil War. They had defeated the nationalists, who fled to Taiwan. For the first time in a long time, China was united. Mao was seen as a hero, a man who freed his people from corruption, warlords, and foreign powers. His face hung in homes, schools, and public offices. His words were studied like sacred truth. To millions, Mao wasn't just a leader, he was a savior. But even heroes can make mistakes, and Mao's next decision would cost millions of lives. In 1958, he launched what he called the Great Leap Forward. It was meant to transform China into a modern industrial nation, fast. Villages were merged into giant communes. People were told to work day and night to produce steel in homemade furnaces. Farmers left their fields to join the industrial dream. On paper, the results looked amazing. Local officials exaggerated numbers to please their bosses. Reports claimed harvests were larger than ever before, but the truth was very different. Fields were empty, food was taken away to meet fake targets, and within a few years, famine spread like wildfire. By the time it was over, somewhere between 20 to 45 million people had died. It was one of the worst human disasters in history. When the truth came out, Mao's image suffered. Other communist leaders began to take charge, men like Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping. They wanted to fix the economy and move away from Mao's radical ideas. Mao felt pushed aside, humiliated, forgotten. He believed the party had become too comfortable, too capitalist, and that his revolution was being betrayed. In his eyes, the people were losing their revolutionary spirit, the fire that had built New China. He wanted that fire back. He wanted to remind the nation what revolution meant, and he wanted to remind everyone that he was still its heart. That's where the seeds of the Cultural Revolution were planted. Mao had a simple belief that revolution should never end. He said that if people stopped fighting for change, they would grow weak, selfish, and lazy. To him, comfort was dangerous. He believed even his own party was full of hidden enemies, people pretending to be loyal, but secretly trying to bring back capitalism. He needed to expose them. And to do that, Mao turned to a new army, not of soldiers, but of students. He said once, "The young people are like the sun at 8 or 9 in the morning. They represent the future." And soon, those young people would become the main weapon in his new revolution. But before Mao could launch this movement, he needed a spark, a reason. In 1965, a small play written by a scholar became that spark. It told the story of an honest official punished by a corrupt emperor. It was just a drama, but Mao supporters claimed it was secretly attacking Mao himself. That was all the excuse he needed. Mao declared that China's culture, its plays, its schools, even its books, were full of hidden enemies who wanted to destroy socialism. It was time, he said, to sweep away the old world, to destroy what he called the four olds: old ideas, old culture, old customs, and old habits. In 1966, Mao made his grand return. After years of silence, he suddenly reappeared, swimming across the Yangtze River at age 72. It wasn't just exercise. It was a message. The image of Mao, strong and smiling, spread across China. He was back. Soon after, the Communist Party announced a new campaign, the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, And this time, the revolution wouldn't be fought in factories or battlefields. It would be fought in hearts, homes, and schools. Students were the first to respond. Across the country, young people formed groups calling themselves Red Guards. They wore red armbands and carried Mao's Little Red Book, a pocket-sized collection of his quotes. They marched in the streets, shouting, "Long live Chairman Mao! Down with the four olds! Revolution is not a crime!" They believed they were protecting the purity of China, fighting against teachers, artists, and even their own parents, who seemed too traditional. At first, the government didn't know what to do, but when Mao publicly praised the Red Guards, everything changed. Officials were told not to stop them. The youth had Mao's blessing. That summer, millions of students from across China poured into Beijing. They gathered in Tiananmen Square, waving red flags and chanting Mao's name. Then, he appeared. Mao stood on the balcony of the Forbidden City, wearing his trademark gray suit, waving to the crowds below. The cheers were deafening. People cried, fainted, screamed in joy. They said it was like seeing the sun itself. In that moment, the Cultural Revolution had truly begun. Soon, Mao's words filled every corner of China. Radios played his speeches. Posters covered the walls. Everyone had to study his book and quote him in daily life. Factories, schools, and offices formed revolutionary committees. People were encouraged to expose counter-revolutionaries. You could be labeled an enemy just for reading a foreign novel, wearing Western-style clothes, or keeping an old family heirloom. The line between loyalty and survival became thin, dangerously thin. The Red Guards grew more aggressive. They began raiding homes, burning books, smashing ancient temples and artworks. Teachers were dragged into public squares and forced to confess fake crimes. Many were beaten, humiliated, or even killed. It wasn't just a political movement anymore. It was personal. Old friendships broke apart. Children reported their parents to the authorities. Communities turned on each other. Mao called it cleansing the class ranks. But to many, it felt like their country had lost its soul. And yet, millions still adored him, because to them, Mao was China. He had freed their nation, united their people, and promised a world where everyone was equal. For the younger generation, those born after the revolution, Mao was the only truth they knew. They grew up with his image in textbooks, his quotes in songs, his words on every wall. To question him felt like betraying the very idea of China. The Cultural Revolution gave them purpose, identity, belonging. It made them feel powerful, part of something bigger than themselves. But power without guidance can be dangerous. And as the months passed, the chaos began to spin out of control. By the end of 1966, schools had stopped teaching. Universities were shut down. The Red Guards ruled the streets. The old ways, respect for teachers, elders, and tradition, were now labeled as reactionary. The nation that had once been built on harmony and learning was being torn apart by its own children. Mao had succeeded in reclaiming power, but what he unleashed would soon grow beyond his control. The Cultural Revolution was no longer just a campaign. It had become a wildfire, and China was burning. China has changed. By the end of 1966, the old order is gone. Schools are silent, teachers are gone, and the Red Guards, millions of them, rule the streets. What began as a political campaign has become a wave of fury sweeping through every corner of the country. And at the center of it all stands Mao Zedong, smiling, calm, and confident. He believes this is not chaos, but rebirth, a cleansing fire that will burn away corruption and rebuild the revolutionary spirit of China. The Red Guards see themselves as Mao's chosen warriors.
the young army of a sacred cause. They wear military-style jackets, red armbands, and bright eyes full of pride. They travel across the country in packed trains, waving the little red book, chanting Mao's words. Long live Chairman Mao! Long live the revolution! At first, their mission feels simple. Destroy the four olds: old ideas, old culture, old customs, and old habits. And so, they begin. Temples are stormed. Buddha statues are smashed. Ancient paintings are burned in bonfires. Family shrines are destroyed, and even gravestones are dug up and broken. History itself is being erased. At home, parents whisper to their children to hide anything old: books, jewelry, even photos. But it's dangerous to hide things. Neighbors report neighbors. Children report parents. People are dragged into the streets for struggle sessions, public humiliations where victims are forced to confess being counter-revolutionary, whether or not they had done anything wrong. Many confess just to survive. Some never come home. What began as youthful excitement turns darker. Rival groups of Red Guards start fighting each other, each one claiming to be more loyal to Mao than the other. Beijing, Shanghai, and many major cities fall into chaos. Trains are full of young revolutionaries traveling from place to place, trying to prove their devotion. They break into museums and universities, burn libraries, and loot old homes. They call it revolution, but for many, it feels like madness. Still, no one dares to question it, because Mao himself is watching, and his smile means approval. In August 1966, Mao appears again on Tiananmen Square. Over 1 million Red Guards have gathered, waiting to see him. He stands above them, waving his hand as if blessing an ocean of red. People scream, cry, faint from joy. Some walk for days just to catch a glimpse of him. To them, seeing Mao once in a lifetime is like meeting the sun. That moment cements everything. Mao has not only regained control, he has captured the hearts of an entire generation. But soon, the movement begins to grow far beyond even what he imagined. The revolution spreads like wildfire. Factories, offices, farms, and even military bases form their own revolutionary committees. Posters appear overnight accusing officials of being capitalist roaders. These posters, called dazibao, are handwritten, pasted on walls, and filled with angry slogans. Sometimes, the people being accused are loyal communists who had worked beside Mao for years. But truth no longer matters. Only loyalty to Mao does. Ordinary life collapses. Trains stop running on time. Schools remain closed. Students who once studied science and math now memorize Mao's quotations instead. Education, art, religion, everything becomes political. In cities, young people destroy anything that represents privilege or the past. Women cut their long hair short to look revolutionary. Men throw away their suits for army green jackets. Marriages are delayed or canceled. Love itself is called a distraction from the struggle. In rural areas, peasants watch in confusion as city youths arrive shouting slogans, telling them how to live and think. The peasants nod politely, but many secretly think the young city people have gone mad. Within the Communist Party, the situation grows dangerous. High-ranking leaders who had once supported Mao start disappearing. Some are imprisoned, others beaten, others die in silence. Yuan Silchi, once the president of China, is accused of being a traitor and the biggest capitalist roader. He is humiliated publicly, imprisoned, and denied medical treatment until his death. Even Deng Xiaoping, another senior leader, is purged and sent away to work in a factory. No one is safe, not even those who built the revolution. At the same time, Mao's wife, Jian Qing, rises in influence.
A former actress, she leads a group that controls art, theater, and film, known later as the Gang of Four. They push for new revolutionary art, operas, plays, and songs that glorify Mao and the Red Guards. Traditional Chinese culture is replaced by propaganda. Music, movies, and books all carry the same message. Mao is the light. Mao is the truth. Mao is China. Across the nation, loudspeakers play revolutionary songs every morning. People wake to the same rhythm, the same chants, the same leader's name. Life becomes an endless performance of loyalty. But behind the slogans, the suffering grows. Old professors, scientists, and artists vanish. Some take their own lives, unable to bear the humiliation. Families are torn apart, not by war this time, but by ideology. In villages, strangers arrive to hold class struggle meetings where people are forced to accuse one another of imaginary crimes. Once trusted friends point fingers just to prove their loyalty. Even Mao begins to worry that things have gone too far. But he can't stop it easily. The movement has taken on its own life. By late 1967, China has turned into a battlefield of ideas and blood. Rival Red Guard groups fight each other with weapons. In some cities, tanks roll through the streets, and soldiers fire on crowds. Factories shut down, trains are derailed, the government nearly stops functioning. Mao turns to the one force still under control, the army. He orders the People's Liberation Army to restore order. Slowly, the army begins to disband the Red Guards and take back the cities. Millions of young people who once felt powerful are suddenly told to leave. They are sent to the countryside to learn from the peasants. For many, it's the end of their dreams and the start of years of hardship. By late 1968, the Red Guard movement, once the beating heart of the Cultural Revolution, starts to fade. China is exhausted. The excitement has turned to fear. And people begin to wonder quietly, was all of this truly for the revolution or just for Mao's power? The Cultural Revolution had reached its most violent peak, but the story was far from over. The years ahead would bring more tragedy, more power struggles, and eventually, the beginning of an end. The storm that began with the Red Guards now sweeps across every corner of China. By 1967, the Cultural Revolution has become more than a movement. It's a way of life. It touches every street, every school, every village. People no longer ask what is true, but what is revolutionary. And those who can't prove their loyalty to Mao begin to disappear. In the heart of cities, Red Guards march in endless parades. They chant slogans, wave flags, and carry Mao's portrait as if it were sacred. Loudspeakers shout orders. Down with the four olds. Destroy old culture, old ideas, old customs, and old habits. The words are simple, but their effect is enormous. Temples that have stood for 1,000 years are smashed apart. Ancient libraries burn through the night, their ashes rising like black snow into the air. Priceless scrolls, artworks, and relics vanish forever. Even family homes are raided. People are told to tear down old photographs, burn family records, and throw away anything that reminds them of the old world. In many houses, the only picture left hanging is of Chairman Mao. Children start reporting their parents for saying the wrong thing. Neighbors whisper about each other's loyalty. Fear seeps into the smallest corners of daily life. A careless joke, a private complaint, even a sigh can be enough to make someone disappear. People stop trusting their friends. Students accuse teachers. Wives betray husbands. The Cultural Revolution turns ordinary citizens into spies, all in the name of purity. Religion, too, is crushed.
Churches are shut down, temples closed, mosques locked. Priests and monks are forced to renounce their faith, or worse. Statues of Buddha are torn apart. Ancient pagodas crumble under sledgehammers. The Red Guards call it liberation, freeing the people from superstition. But to many it feels like their soul has been stolen. Education suffers deeply. Schools and universities remain closed for years. Books not written by Mao are banned. Mathematics, science, and literature are replaced by political study. Students memorize Mao's words instead of learning new ideas. Many teachers are beaten or sent to the countryside to be re-educated through labor. Young people once dreaming of becoming scientists, poets, or engineers now spend their days shouting slogans or working in the fields. An entire generation grows up without proper schooling, a lost generation. And yet, through all this destruction, many still believe they are building something new. Posters show happy farmers and smiling workers, all holding Mao's little red book. They dream of equality, of unity, of a China free of greed. But in reality, the country is falling into confusion. Factories slow down because skilled workers are accused of being capitalist experts. Hospitals lack doctors because many have been purged. Trains stop running on time because no one wants to take responsibility for mistakes. The nation begins to suffocate under the weight of its own revolution. In the countryside, peasants who once worshipped ancestors are told to destroy ancestral tablets. Festivals and traditional weddings are banned. Even birthday celebrations are called bourgeois. The Red Guards rename streets and cities, replacing old names with revolutionary ones. Prosperity Street becomes Red Flag Avenue. Temple Hill becomes Revolution Hill. Everything that connected people to their past is being erased. And for many, the hardest part isn't the fear, it's the emptiness that follows. Without the old customs, the music, the books, the festivals, life feels colorless, even when everything around them is painted red. By 1968, Mao begins to realize that the Red Guards he once praised are becoming too powerful. Their loyalty is no longer just to him, but to their own violent energy. They fight among themselves, occupy government buildings, and challenge military authority. China is now in chaos. Transportation halts, factories stop, and food shortages grow. To regain control, Mao makes a new decision, one that changes millions of lives. He orders the Down to the Countryside movement. More than 17 million young people, mostly city students, are sent to rural villages to live and work with peasants. They are told this will teach them humility and help them understand the life of real workers. For many, it's the first time leaving their homes. They travel for days on crowded trains, carrying only a few belongings. When they arrive, they find hard labor, poor living conditions, and endless fields of mud. They dig ditches, plant rice, and share tiny huts with farming families. Some adapt, some give up, and some never return home. The movement is supposed to purify the youth, but it mostly breaks their spirit. They learn endurance, yes, but they also lose their dreams. Back in the cities, the violence continues. Public struggle sessions become a terrifying routine. Accused people are paraded through streets wearing heavy signs that list their so-called crimes. Crowds shout, spit, and sometimes strike them. Few dare to defend the victims To do so would mean joining them. In some towns, entire families are wiped out simply because one ancestor had been a teacher or a businessman. Countless people die from humiliation, beatings, or imprisonment. And the more people suffer, the more propaganda promises that a brighter tomorrow is coming. By now, even high-ranking communist leaders are not safe. Many of Mao's old allies are accused of being traitors or capitalist roaders. Among them is Liu Shaoqi, China's president, once considered Mao's close comrade. Liu questions Mao's extreme methods and pays the price. He is removed from power, beaten, and kept under house arrest until his death. Another victim is Deng Xiaoping, a practical reformer. He, too, is branded as a capitalist, forced out of politics and sent away for re-education. With his critics gone, Mao's power becomes absolute once again. But the country he controls is scarred and silent. By the early 1970s, China's great civilization, once known for its poetry, inventions, and traditions, is unrecognizable. The Great Wall still stands, but behind it, schools are empty, temples are destroyed, and millions live in quiet fear. Mao has achieved what he wanted. The old China is gone. But in its place, there is confusion, a nation without balance, history, or direction. The Red Guards are eventually disbanded, and the army takes back control. But the damage to China's culture and spirit will take decades to heal. And yet, somewhere deep beneath the ashes of destroyed temples and burned books, a new generation waits, one that has seen both faith and fanaticism. They will grow up asking questions that no one dared to ask before. The Cultural Revolution has destroyed China's traditions, but it has also planted the seeds of reflection. The Cultural Revolution that once promised a pure and equal China has now turned into a storm without direction. By 1969, the fires Mao set are burning everything and everyone in their path. Factories stand half empty. Schools remain closed. The countryside struggles to feed itself. And though millions still shout Mao's name, deep down the people are exhausted. The revolution has eaten its own children. Mao knows the chaos has gone too far. The Red Guards, who once answered only to him, are now fighting each other. Cities echo with gunfire. Different factions of true revolutionaries clash in violent battles, each claiming to be defending the real spirit of Mao. In some provinces, even military bases are attacked. Trains carrying grain are stopped by mobs demanding revolutionary supplies. And in many villages, the local government no longer exists. Only fear and confusion remain. In 1969, Mao decides to restore some order. He dissolves most Red Guard groups and calls upon the People's Liberation Army, or PLA, to take control. The young Red Guards who once ruled the streets are suddenly told to go home or to the countryside. Many are sent to remote areas to work on farms, far from the cities they once dominated. But the damage is already deep. The very generation that Mao had called the future of the revolution is now lost, without education, without jobs, and without hope. They had dreamed of building a new world. Instead, they destroyed the old one and found nothing in its place. As Mao reasserts control, his inner circle begins to shift. Some of his oldest allies are gone, imprisoned, humiliated, or dead. But a new group rises in their place. At the center of this new circle is Jiang Qing, Mao's wife. Once a famous actress, she now becomes a powerful political figure. Along with three of Mao's loyal supporters, Zhang Xunqiao, Yao Wenwan, and Wang Hongwen, they form what would later be called the Gang of Four. These four control China's propaganda, media, and culture. They promote Mao's image as godlike, and anyone who dares to question them faces persecution. Under Jiang Qing's command, art and entertainment are completely remade. All traditional plays, films, and music are banned. In their place, new revolutionary operas are created, filled with soldiers, farmers, and heroic workers. Even beauty is redefined. Bright colors and jewelry are called bourgeois. Women are told to look plain and strong, like revolutionaries, not like movie stars. Through art and media, the Gang of Four keeps Mao's ideology alive, as even the nation begins to crumble underneath. Meanwhile, Mao's health starts to decline. He is aging, tired, and suffering from illness, but no one dares to say it aloud. In China, Mao is still treated as the red sun in the sky. Behind the scenes, however, power struggles begin to form, silent, dangerous games that could decide the future of the country. One man quietly rises again, Zhou Enlai, China's premier. Zhou has always been careful, loyal to Mao, but more moderate in his decisions. He understands the damage the Cultural Revolution has done, and he tries to rebuild what he can. He reopens some schools and restarts limited international relations. Thanks to him, China begins to reach out to the world again, including one of the most surprising moments in modern history, the visit of U.S. President Richard Nixon in 1972. That meeting shocks the world. For decades, China and America had been enemies. Now, Nixon shakes hands with Mao in Beijing. It is a symbol. China is slowly coming out of isolation. But inside the country, millions are still trapped in fear. While diplomats smile on television, ordinary citizens whisper at home, still afraid to say the wrong thing. Zhou Enlai's calm leadership brings a little stability, but he is constantly attacked by Jiang Qing and her group. They call him too soft, too capitalist, too forgiving. Yet Zhou endures, quietly protecting many from persecution behind the scenes. But then, in early 1976, tragedy strikes. Zhou Enlai dies. His death breaks the hearts of millions. People pour into Tiananmen Square, leaving flowers and poems in his memory. For many, Zhou was a symbol of kindness and reason, a rare light in dark times. But the government, led by the Gang of Four, calls these public gatherings counter-revolutionary. They send soldiers to clear the square, arrest mourners, and destroy the tributes. The people are stunned. Even grief has become a crime. And beneath the surface, anger starts to grow. By 1976, the Cultural Revolution is collapsing under its own weight. Factories are failing, food shortages are spreading, and ordinary citizens are losing faith in the system. Mao's once unshakable image begins to crack. People still shout his slogans, but the passion is gone. They obey out of habit, not belief. The air of China feels heavy, as if the country itself is holding its breath. That same year, another disaster strikes, the Tangshan earthquake. It kills hundreds of thousands of people and destroys an entire city. Many see it as a sign, a warning that the heavens themselves are angry. And then, just weeks later, Mao Zedong dies. It is September 9th, 1976. The great helmsman who ruled China for decades is gone. The news spreads slowly, carefully controlled by the government. But when the announcement finally comes, the nation falls into silence. Some weep uncontrollably, some stand in disbelief, and others, secretly, feel a strange sense of relief. Because for 10 long years, China had lived in fear of his words. Now, at last, those words no longer ruled their lives. But Mao's death leaves a question that terrifies the party. Who will lead next? Jiang Qing and the Gang of Four believe they should inherit Mao's revolution. They control the media and still command influence over the army. They speak boldly, claiming they will carry the chairman's torch. But others inside the party see them as dangerous, responsible for years of chaos and suffering. In this tense atmosphere, one man returns from political exile.
Deng Xiaoping. Once labeled a traitor, he had been banished during the Cultural Revolution. Now, with Mao gone and the people hungry for stability, Deng's practical leadership style becomes a hope for the future. He believes China needs less ideology and more common sense, more food, more jobs, more peace. Behind closed doors, alliances form, and in a dramatic move just a month after Mao's death, the Gang of Four is arrested. The news spreads like wildfire. The architects of fear are finally gone. Crowds fill the streets, cheering quietly, crying, or just standing still in disbelief. For the first time in 10 years, people feel the weight beginning to lift. The Cultural Revolution, Mao's great social experiment, is finally over, but its scars run deep. Families are broken, teachers are gone, temples and books are destroyed. A generation of young people has grown up without real education or guidance. The revolution that was meant to bring equality has instead brought emptiness. In the months that follow, China starts to look inward, to reflect. New leaders promise to learn from the past. They begin reopening schools, rebuilding industries, and restoring calm. And though it will take decades, the country slowly begins to heal. Yet the memory of the Cultural Revolution never disappears. Even today, the topic remains sensitive, painful to talk about, but impossible to forget. Because behind every slogan, every march, every portrait of Mao, there were real people, farmers, teachers, artists, and children whose lives were forever changed. It is said that history teaches us lessons, but in China's case, the Cultural Revolution became more than a lesson. It became a warning of what happens when a single idea becomes more important than humanity itself. The decade of chaos has ended. The old world is gone. A new chapter for China is about to begin. But the question remains, after everything that was destroyed, what will rise in its place? When Mao Zedong died in 1976, it was as if time stopped in China. For a decade, every word, every action, every dream had revolved around him. Now, for the first time in years, the country stood still, lost, uncertain, and quiet. Across cities and villages, millions of people gathered to mourn. Loudspeakers played slow funeral music. Radio stations broadcast nothing but tributes. In schools and factories, workers bowed their heads in silence. Even those who had suffered during the Cultural Revolution found it hard to imagine life without Mao. He had been the face of China for as long as they could remember, both its hope and its fear. But beneath the tears, another emotion was growing up: relief. For many, Mao's death also marked the end of an era of terror. The loudspeakers that once shouted orders now played softly. The slogans on the walls began to fade. And people quietly asked themselves, what now? China was broken, spiritually, economically, and socially. Millions had been displaced. Factories were failing. Schools and universities had lost an entire generation of teachers and students. The nation's soul was tired. Something had to change. After Mao's death, China faced a silent power struggle. On one side was the Gang of Four, led by Mao's widow, Jiang Qing. They claimed they were the rightful protectors of Mao's legacy, the true revolutionaries. On the other side stood those who wanted peace and stability. Officials who had grown weary of endless political campaigns. They wanted to rebuild what had been destroyed. And in this fragile moment, a new figure began to rise again: Deng Xiaoping. Deng was not new to Chinese politics. He had been purged twice during the Cultural Revolution, accused of being a capitalist road taker. But he had something that others lacked:
experience, patience, and a deep understanding of ordinary people's needs. He didn't speak in fiery slogans. He spoke of rebuilding schools, growing food, and modernizing industries. He said something simple yet revolutionary. It doesn't matter if a cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice. It was a message of practicality, a sharp contrast to the ideological chaos of the past 10 years. In October 1976, just a month after Mao's death, the Gang of Four was arrested. The reaction was disbelief, then relief. The very people who had controlled China's propaganda, fear, and punishment for years were now gone. Crowds gathered in the streets, whispering that a new dawn might be coming. People began to laugh again, softly, carefully, as if testing what freedom sounded like. The Cultural Revolution was officially over. But ending it on paper was one thing. Healing from it was another. Everywhere you looked, there were signs of the past. Families missing loved ones, schools without teachers, libraries half empty, fields without enough workers. It was as if the entire country had aged a century in 10 years. The question now was not who to punish, but how to rebuild. Slowly, the government began to reopen schools and universities. Young people who had been sent to the countryside were called back to cities. A new system of examinations was introduced to restore education. For the first time in years, students sat in classrooms again, pencils in hand, eyes full of hope. Parents wept quietly watching their children go to school. It was a small sign, but it meant everything. After a decade of fear, knowledge was no longer a crime. China's leaders also began rethinking the economy. The country had been isolated for years, but now the world was changing fast, and Deng Xiaoping believed China could not afford to be left behind. He pushed for reforms, small at first, then larger. Farmers were allowed to keep part of what they grew. Workers were rewarded for productivity. Foreign trade was cautiously reopened. These were simple steps, but they began to breathe life back into a suffocating nation. Meanwhile, the Cultural Revolution was slowly being examined, not in anger, but in reflection. Leaders admitted, carefully, for the first time, that mistakes were made. Millions of people who had been wrongly accused were cleared of charges. Teachers were invited back to classrooms. Writers and artists returned to work. And families could finally mourn their loved ones openly. For the first time in years, truth began to replace fear. In 1978, Deng Xiaoping officially became China's top leader. His message was clear: let's put the Cultural Revolution behind us, let's rebuild China. He launched what became known as the Four Modernizations, focusing on agriculture, industry, science, and defense. These reforms opened doors that had been closed for decades. Villages that once struggled to survive began growing crops efficiently again. Cities started rebuilding factories. Students returned to study abroad, and slowly, trade with other nations resumed. For ordinary Chinese citizens, this was more than an economic change. It was a breath of freedom. Still, Deng never openly condemned Mao. He called Mao a great leader who made serious mistakes. To the government, Mao remained the founder of modern China, but not beyond criticism. This careful balance allowed the country to move forward without tearing itself apart. China would respect Mao's role in history, but it would not repeat his errors. It was a delicate, wise decision, one that shaped the China we know today. In homes across the country, people began restoring traditions that had been banned. Families celebrated New Year with old customs. Temples reopened. Ancient festivals returned. Children once again learned poetry, painting, and calligraphy, arts that had been silenced. Music and laughter returned to the streets. It wasn't immediate, it wasn't perfect, but it was healing. At the same time, those who lived through the Cultural Revolution carried invisible scars. Many could not forget the betrayals, the fear, or the faces of friends who never came home. Some struggled with guilt for staying silent when others were hurt. Others found it hard to forgive. But time began to do what politics could not. It softened the pain. The people of China didn't forget, but they learned to live again. In 1981, the Chinese government finally released an official verdict. The Cultural Revolution was a mistake, a severe setback to the party and the nation. For the first time, the government admitted that the 10-year campaign had caused grave harm. It was a historic moment, not just of truth, but of courage. By acknowledging the wounds, China took its first real step towards healing them. Deng Xiaoping's reforms continued. He encouraged innovation, allowed small businesses, and opened the country to the global market. He called it socialism with Chinese characteristics. It was a new direction, one that combined discipline with progress, control with creativity. And for the first time in decades, people began to dream again of homes, education, travel, and stability. The chaos was finally fading into memory. In villages and towns, old men sat under trees talking quietly about the past. They spoke of the hunger, the parades, the fear, and how it all slowly ended. Young people listened, wide-eyed, unable to imagine such times. For them, the Cultural Revolution had become a story, one that felt far away. But for their parents, it was still a shadow that never fully left. By the early 1980s, China had changed dramatically. Factories buzzed again. Markets were alive with color. Students carried books, not political banners. The nation that once destroyed its traditions was now learning to rebuild them, stronger and wiser. The Cultural Revolution was over, but its lessons remained, whispered in classrooms, remembered at dinner tables, and written in history books. The people had learned the cost of blind devotion, the danger of fear, and the strength of truth. And so, as China entered a new era of growth and reform, it carried with it a silent promise never to let such darkness fall again. Because the revolution that once promised to purify China had instead left it wounded. Now, it was time to heal. By the mid-1970s, the fires of the Cultural Revolution had begun to fade, but the damage was everywhere. 10 long years of struggle had left China exhausted. Factories stood silent. Schools were empty or broken. Families mourned loved ones lost, not to war, but to suspicion and fear. What had begun as a campaign to purify the nation had instead torn it apart. The Red Guards, once the pride of Mao's movement, had lost their direction. Many had grown older, realizing that the enemies they fought were their own neighbors, teachers, or even parents. Even Mao Zedong himself, the man who had once commanded unshakable loyalty, seemed distant and weakened. His health was failing, his closest allies fought among themselves for power, and the country drifted in confusion. By 1976, China was like a great ship sailing through fog, leaderless, wounded, uncertain of where it was going. That same year, 3 major events shook the nation. First came the Tangshan earthquake, one of the deadliest in history, killing hundreds of thousands. Then, in April, Zhou Enlai, the beloved premier of China, passed away. He had been a voice of calm and moderation through all the chaos, and when he died, millions of people wept in silence. Public mourning for Zhou soon turned into quiet protest. Crowds gathered in Tiananmen Square, placing flowers and poems, expressing both love for Zhou and hidden sorrow for their suffering. The government saw this as rebellion. Riot police were sent in. People were beaten and arrested. For many, this was the moment they realized something deep, that the revolution had gone too far. It was no longer about ideals or equality. It had become about survival. And then, in September 1976, it happened. Mao Zedong, the man who had shaped China for decades, passed away. He was 82 years old. The news spread like thunder. Radio stations played mourning music.
Factories blew long, echoing whistles. Millions of people cried openly in the streets. For some, it was the loss of a father figure, the man who had given them faith and purpose. For others, it was quiet relief, the end of a long, dark night. But one thing was clear: an era had ended. The storm that began in 1966 had finally come to rest. After Mao's death, China stood at a crossroads. The revolution had changed everything: politics, culture, education, and daily life, yet it had left the country weaker than before. The economy was in ruins. Farmers had little to eat. Scientists and teachers who had been punished were now urgently needed to rebuild the nation. A new leader slowly rose to prominence: Deng Xiaoping. He had been criticized, humiliated, and even sent away during the Cultural Revolution, but he returned with a clear vision. He told the people, "It doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice." It was his way of saying, what matters now is not ideology, not slogans, but progress. China needed food, jobs, and stability more than endless revolutions. Under Deng's leadership, China began a great transformation. The government opened the doors to the world, allowed private businesses, and encouraged education and science again. People started to rebuild their homes, their families, and their dreams. Books once banned were printed again. Students returned to classrooms, and the wounds of the past, though deep, began to slowly heal. The Cultural Revolution was officially declared a serious mistake in the 1980s. The government admitted that millions had suffered unjustly and that the chaos had caused the most severe setback since the founding of modern China. But those words could never fully describe the pain of a lost generation. Young people who had grown up fighting instead of learning, families that never saw their loved ones again, or artists and thinkers whose voices had been silenced. Yet, even from this dark chapter, China learned something powerful. It learned the importance of balance, that no single leader, no single idea should ever control the hearts and minds of millions without question. It learned that education and freedom of thought are the roots of real progress. And it learned that a nation's strength is not built from fear, but from trust and understanding. Today, when we look at China, its skyscrapers, its technology, its booming cities, it's hard to imagine the silence and fear that once filled its streets. But the memories remain. They remind the people where they came from and what happens when power grows unchecked. The Cultural Revolution ended nearly 50 years ago, but its echoes still whisper in the stories of grandparents, in history books, and in the lessons every generation must learn anew. The Cultural Revolution was a time of pain and awakening, a storm that changed the soul of a nation. And like all storms, it passed. What remained was the lesson that true revolution begins not with destruction, but with understanding, compassion, and courage to learn from our own mistakes. As we reach the end of this journey, take a quiet moment to think about what we've seen. The Cultural Revolution began with a dream: to create equality, to erase corruption, to make society pure. But in the search for perfection, millions suffered, and a nation nearly lost its voice. History reminds us that true change never comes from force or fear. It grows from understanding, respect, and the courage to question even the ideas we believe in most. China's story didn't end in darkness. It rebuilt, stronger, wiser, and more aware of the power of its people. And through that recovery, the world learned an unforgettable truth: that no matter how deep the storm, human spirit always finds a way to rise again. Thank you for watching. If you believe stories like this should be remembered, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so history's lessons never fade into silence.